Hi, everybody. Here we are together again, and I'm going to try to keep this a little bit more brief tonight. When it gets on over towards 30 minutes, folks begin to somewhat lose their attention span, and so I want to make this a little shorter, but get to the point so that I can hold your attention and help you a little bit more with your studies. Of course, you're reading chapter 5, and these two chapters are highly related with each other. And looking at one of the subtexts here is looking at the changing dominant minority group relationships as the subsistence technology changes. Um, and going back to Lansky's notion that as the material base or the subsistence technology changes, that the dominant minority group relations change. So under the chapter 4 on an agrarian society, we have paternalistic relations between dominant minority group members. Uh, and then with the after the Civil War, and especially after the after Reconstruction, you have what's known as a competitive, rigid form of dominant minority group relations. And in today's society, what we make term a post-industrial society, the relations are known now as a fluid competitive form, something more akin to an equality, if you will. Fluid in the sense there's an openness to compete with fewer barriers, but barriers are there nonetheless, and we'll speak to what some of those different types of barriers are in today's society. But just a general scenario, uh, you know, during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, we had a much better situation for African Americans who were finally freed from slavery. During this time, they had a chance to take on their own businesses, education, even taking political office. But it was short-lived. In the early 1880s, the federal government withdrew from the South, and at that time, the plantation style economy returned to the South. So we weren't going to have an immediate type of rapid industrialization in the South. It was a backward looking kind of conservative takeover of the planter system again, except for this time they didn't have slaves and weren't going to have slaves. So they reinvented a system. They invented a system that was the nearest, I guess you might say, best thing, and that was called the sharecropping tenant system in the South that went on after Reconstruction up until really until the 1960s with the civil rights movement and further industrialization in the South. But this was a important period of changing relations. Since African Americans were no longer in slavery, they could not be fully marginalized in that sense. So we see the development of the sharecropping system, and along with that, we see some political movement to disenfranchise, the notion of the disenfranchisement laws. And these were put in place to disenfranchise, again, to marginalize African Americans, not by the method of slavery, but from exclusion from participation in society. And there was also, because of the sharecropping system, you had a growing alliance, especially in the 1890s, became known as the populist movement between poor working whites, sharecropping whites, and poor African American sharecroppers. They had an economic stake together, and there was this economic interest that they shared that ended up uniting into a political populist movement to redress all the wrongs of the sharecropping system. And it was at this time that really the racism and the divide and conquer, if you will, playing the race cards happened. And basically, this was a sort of movement from above. You had this reemergence of a planter class, landowners, and a backward looking agrarian economy now based in sharecropping. And the way in which the planters mobilized, they knew that there was this split, and they wanted to defeat this movement, this unity. And so they began to put in play the race card, as I said, and racism became very violent during this time period. And you had the disenfranchisement laws were put into place to again marginalize African Americans as free players in the economic arena. So they basically conquered and divide and conquered, so that at least now they were winning the poor whites' allegiance. It's not so much the poor against the rich against the poor. It's a kind of we against them. So African Americans were seen as an out group, and so the poor white sharecroppers began to see that at least they had one step above in joining with the white planter class against African Americans, that they were like one step above African Americans in this situation. So this led to a rigid, because of the disenfranchisement, de jure segregation, Jim Crow system. De jure segregation means being segregated by law. It's legal segregation. It was termed the Jim Crow laws, the Jim Crow system. Because of this system, then um, African Americans in the South were again marginalized in their participation in their newly won freedom to compete, right? To be able to compete on an equal footing. Uh, so, read this part of they talk quite a bit, and you can read quite a bit about the control of black labor, sharecropping, the reinforcing of the system, sort of a history aspect there. Uh, One thing to think about is during this time, prejudice and racism increased. It was really more viral than it had ever been under slavery. Again, and this kind of logically makes sense. When you have a group that at least has some competitive footing, uh, you know, uh, the prejudice and the racism become excuses for the disenfranchisement laws. Another theme and another pattern in this textbook is that things such as ideological racism, prejudice, are not the causes, but the excuses for some other activity. And from this author's standpoint, it is the economic interest in society. And so it was in the economic interest of the elites to work to divide and conquer poor white sharecroppers and poor African American sharecroppers, and to marginalize African Americans with the Jim Crow system, de jure segregation. Prejudice and racism again becomes an excuse. It becomes an ideology for why this is taking place. And another subtext that you can read through these chapters is the changing stereotypes, which falls under prejudice and racism. That was changing stereotype content as the conditions change. There's a great video that deals with this from slavery to modern times. It's called Ethnic Notions. And I'll check and see. We have a video here on campus, but I'll see if it's available on YouTube. And if it is, I'll look tonight. I'll place that up there, and I'll send you an email, let you know about it, so that you can watch it. It's a very effective and interesting, insightful video. Then it talks about also life in the North. This chapter does, and it looks at some changing conditions, especially pay attention and study the two major migration patterns out of the South. One of the old saying is that we can vote with our feet, and so they were free. African Americans at least had the ability to move, and this certainly happened in the early part of the 20th century, and also mid 20th century, in the 1950s and early 1960s. You had another migration. African Americans moving out of the South, moving into the more liberalized North, urban North, where there was not a dependence on agriculture, just the size of the large cities where the African American communities had more independence and were able to compete more on equal footing. However, we know from reading the chapter that African Americans in the North also faced various types of prejudice and discrimination, maybe of a different kind, what we call de facto discrimination. It's not written in law, but it's practiced in a kind of institutionalized discrimination, such as called phenomena like redlining, right, for housing, to keep minority members out in a certain geographical area within the city. And so you had this kind of geographical segregation that continues today in many major northern Rust Belt cities. Some of your most, you would think that some of your most top uh, uh, segregated cities would be located in the South, and that's not the way it is. Geographically, the South is pretty much integrated. But in the North, you have, like in Detroit, where I used to teach. I had African. I used to teach in the various sub area subdivisions, suburban areas around Detroit, and most of my folks were from my students were from the big car industry back in the mid '90s, and I was surprised to know that I had some students, African American students, that had never had that much contact with in school, for example. Never had any contact with white students, and I had many white students that never had any exposure or contact with African American folk and African American culture, and as well with other immigrant groups and de facto segregated, highly segregated cities by geography. When people live on one side of the river, people live on the other, and the two never really have a lot of interaction with each other. And schools are segregated by geography, so that people really didn't have much interaction with each other, and quite a bit of prejudice and discriminatory behavior in the northern cities, just based on a different type of subsistence technology. Um, but that said, you had the development of urban areas that became thriving African American centers in Chicago, in New York City, Washington D.C., and we're thriving for many years until we get to the post-industrial society and deindustrialization period, like in Chicago, and where all the industry in the inner cities left and deindustrialized. A lot of them leaving for more suburban areas or even moving southward into the South. That whole phenomenon in the 70s and 80s with a lot of businesses moving south, and so that people that were caught in these inner cities without jobs and too poor to move or to follow jobs is where we see today the issues of inner city poverty and all the ills that go along with poverty. Some of the communities in Chicago, the Fernie Green, Robert Taylor projects, which today are stereotyped as, you know, about with gangs and the poverty that's there. These communities, before industry left, these community areas were highly ethnically diverse, and diverse by professions, and we're pretty much well off. But with that deindustrializing of the northern cities, inner cities, it really just left people in poverty, and that's where we see all the ills that we see today. That a lot of times it's blamed on the individuals themselves. If you study the history, you see why people are where they are today, and it has to do with changing economic situations. Page 199, 97 looks at a few important areas. The industrialization, the shift to post-industrial society and dominant minority group relations, general trends. It talks about here some freeing aspects, structural aspects of an industrializing society, a post-industrializing society as well. And that's the increase in urbanization as people move out of rural areas where you had a lot of paternalistic controls, labor controls, to a more to more competitive forms. And also, urbanization allowed for people to gather in large numbers so that they could be able to organize their common interests from their common standpoint, such as in Atlanta, Georgia, um, where you had a movement. The early signs in the development of the civil rights movement was based in urbanization. In urban areas, you had industrialization going on in the South, like Atlanta and other cities. And at that point, then the interest of the rural elite, the plantation, the planter class in the rural areas, were losing their power, their hegemony, if you will, as those at the top of the heap, because industrialists were beginning to, in industrial society was beginning to form, and that interest was taking over. And with urbanization and with industrialization, then you have a different set of needs. First of all, in industrialization, you need a labor force that's free to move. So there's a freedom. You don't need people living on a plot of land generation after generation. You need workers who are free to move. So that structural need for freedom of workers to move from place to place in looking for work, and the competitiveness of industrial employment indirectly work towards freeing, changing conditions for minority group members, so giving them more of a competitive edge, if you will, even though there were still problems with that existed, especially in the North, with unionization. A lot of times unions ended up practicing forms of discrimination against minority group members and trying to keep them from being competitive with the working class, the higher paid working class. And they talk about this in the split labor market theory, that it was, that it was the higher paid dominant group labor, white labor, that ended up being prejudicial towards lower wage, those who may work for a lower wage and cross the union lines, if you will, and take their jobs. So that sense of competition. So they work to try to keep minority groups at bay, if you will, in terms of competition, to marginalize them. But nonetheless, the development of industrialization, urbanization, you have the occupational specialization begins to grow. No longer is it just a simple, farmers and plantation owners, and now you have a host of other many specializations, a complex division of labor growing that demands people to be able to be educated and to specialize in different areas. And so this was also freeing. Bureaucracy and rationality helps to move the society away from being based in steeped in old ways of thinking, folk tales, and even religious types of thinking, uh, and moving towards a more objective, rationalized kinds of thinking. And in that context, then so many of your stereotypes and prejudices are seen as irrational and emotional, based in emotion. And so bureaucracy and rationality, based on rationality, leads to, again, a movement towards more rational forms of thinking and away from emotionally based, stereotypical thinking. Also, you have a growing white collar jobs in the middle class, and you have this growth of the service sector. And with this, with the growth of white collar jobs, and we also begin to see the development of a class structure within minority group communities. Before they were seen as more or less homogeneous, but under industrialization and movement north into the urban areas, you begin to see a class division growing, say, for example, within the African American community. Uh, and today it's even grown even further, so that we see a class structure: upper middle class, working class African Americans, and those that are uh, term is used underclass, those who are homeless or living in the street. And so the class structure has somewhat divided minority group in terms of their solidarity. But still, again, industrialization has played also a freeing role out of its just out of the nature and the needs of the system itself, has had a profound impact on making things at least more competitive and less rigid. But one thing we've had a problem with in the modern industrial society has been between primary occupations and secondary labor market. And in your primary market, you have these are your more secure, credentialized occupations, professional occupations, with secure salaries instead of being paid by hourly wage, good benefits, and the kind of jobs that we are all go back to school is what we're looking for, is a job in the primary sector. And then the other sector is secondary labor market. And secondary labor market is those kind of jobs like which what is it, about 40% of the population now is engaged in like the fast food industry, for example. All these part-time, irregular kinds of jobs, little pay, no real security. So the total opposite, of the primary sector. And unfortunately, what we find here is that minority group members tend to be overrepresented in that secondary labor market, and the dominant group is overrepresented in the primary. And so one of the big contentions between dominant minority groups at this time is over education and the ability to go to school and to compete on an equal footing. And so education has become it's become the credentialized society, so that you need those degrees in order to move into that primary sector. And historically, dominant group members have had more access to the college or university degree, and minority groups are certainly catching up now, but wasn't always that way. And so there's this need to to continue having access to college. And with conditions now, it's getting harder and harder for people to be able to attend a 4-year. I'll just let that phone ring if you guys don't mind. I'm just going to keep going. I think it might be my sister-in-law. My wife's not here right now, so I think she'll be okay. But anyway, so education is a contention, and something that really at this time is being struggled over. All you got to do is look at the price of your books, tuition hikes, all that goes into play. And so, like other areas of life, in terms of in terms of the material existence in society, people are struggle over their getting a fair share of the piece of the pie, if you will. And unless you inherit wealth in our society or win the lottery, really the only other way for social mobility, or unless you marry somebody that's already wealthy, the only other way for social mobility is through education. And the more education you can get, the better. Supposedly that should lead to a better paying primary sector job. Though we're finding more and more that college graduates and even people with my degrees, like PhD, I think in my field, sociology, only about 50% of graduates with a PhD. A little over 50% end up in a tenured teaching positions. A lot of them end up doing other professional jobs. Others even doing menial, secondary type of labor, maybe for some years. Some for the rest of their lives. So it's an ongoing struggle over scarce resources, if you will. Uh, so with under industrialization, then we have the movement towards we had that rigid, competitive rigid form. Uh, but when we get into post-industrial society, uh, we move over to what's called a fluid competitive form. Civil rights movement has been successful, and some of the other social movements that took their lessons from the civil rights movement, the women's movement, you had movements among other minority groups such as Native American movement, the gay and lesbian liberation movement. All of these movements have had a profound impact towards producing more equality and more ability to compete on a fluid basis. And so that today we talk about the fluid form. A fluid form means on a more, now many of the more blatant forms of barriers may have been removed, uh, but and people are maybe getting better chances now to compete on an equal footing, but still there is the discrimination historical legacy that's left there, where, as this text easily shows us, how uh, some groups are further advanced in terms of their integration into society than others have. African Americans didn't really have a real strong footing for competition, especially in the South, until the 1960s, and with the end of segregation laws in the South. So that's just a few decades ago. So African Americans have come a long way in those few decades, but still have quite a bit of roadblocks in the way of catching up. If nothing else, just the catching up process it takes a long time. We see this with the graduation rates for minority members in college degrees. They're still less in numbers, but it's getting better, but it's still, there's that disparity. Another aspect is what the book talks about, modern forms of racism, modern racism, and under present conditions, here we have a African American president, and a lot of people espouse that, hey, where's the problem? There's no more any problems between the races. Everybody's on equal footing. No more need for food stamps and all this kind of. And they're arguing right now about cutting food stamps for folks, and so it's the sense of modern racism based on the notion of, hey, everything's fine, everything's good going pretty good for me. I know it should be going pretty good for everybody else, and so it's sort of a blatant, not a blatant, but an unintended form of oversight. Just not recognizing the problems that are still ongoing, as the text tries to point out for us, that discrimination has not ended. And many of the forms we have now is maybe not so much the blatant form, that certainly are still forms of that, but a lot of it now is what's called the unintended forms of discrimination, or indirect institutional discrimination, where people get hurt because of changing policies. For example, the whole need for now for education puts people sometimes at a disadvantage because among their group members there hasn't been a real history of college education. And so going through that adjustment, trying to catch up and compete through educational credentials. And the chapter talks about affirmative action. Affirmative action was and is a policy that was put in place to try to redress some of this slag, if you will, in terms of being able to compete for positions, so that that minorities should be given a chance to take a job and to begin to redress some of the numbers lowness in numbers, for example, in terms of business and education, faculty members, and in other areas of social life, to try to equalize the occupational scale, if you will, to diversify it, so that it reflects the social equality that we espouse as a democratic society based in equality. So affirmative action is just a program, laws put in place to try to redress some of these long-held problems of inequality in terms of access to competition for equal competition. So that's pretty much basically it. There's certainly other concepts that if there's any concept that you have a problem with understanding, please email me, and I'll be more than happy to give you some more insight on any of the theories, any of the ideas, any of the concepts. I'm more than happy to give you more clarity and insight on those. But for the main part, this is the thrust of these two chapters that we've covered here, and so our next exam is going to be over chapters 4 and 5. These are the two really theoretical chapters. This sort of ends Healy's built his theoretical model, if you will. And then after this, starting with chapter 6 through most of the rest of the book, case studies, utilizing some of the theories that you've learned, some of the ideas that you've learned in these first 5 chapters, and then we're going to apply those. And so you'll notice that the book becomes much more historical in perspective. And what I'll be stressing during this time, from chapter 6 on, we'll be stressing the timelines. What were the major governmental policies, programs, social movements, head figures of social movements that existed in the timeline progression historically for the various minority groups and immigrant groups as well. And so I think you'll find a shift in orientation, a bit more historical, but we'll still be using and illustrating some of the theoretical ideas that you were exposed to in the first 5 chapters. So go ahead, I've left you some study tips. They're just tips, they're not everything, but usually these tips will cover more than one question. So some of these tips may cover 3 or 4 questions, like the Noel hypothesis. There may be 4 or 5 questions on the test dealing with the Noel hypothesis. A lot of wiggle room there for questions, when you're dealing with concepts such as the Noel hypothesis. So study up, and again, if you have any question whatsoever, please email me, and I'll open this exam on Sunday at midnight. I'm going to open up at midnight on Sunday. And so it'll be open all day Monday, and then it'll close Tuesday at midnight. And so make sure you're well on your way to finish an exam before midnight Tuesday, because it'll close automatically. So make sure you get it done well before midnight Tuesday. And same test format. Not everyone did so great on the first exam, but I was very well pleased. There's many of you that did very, very well, above average grades in that first exam. So I'd like to see this again. I'd like to see all of you do well on this exam. And so I'll see you unless otherwise. If you send me some emails, I'm glad to respond. But otherwise, I'll see you post-exam, I guess you would say. And also, I'll have you some, and especially as we're going through these case studies, I'll have some more videos for you to watch off of YouTube, and also debates. And we'll do a debate on this from this last chapter, but I'll do that next week. Right now, I'm just more concerned that you study for exams, so not crowding you with more readings this week. Just spend time on these 2 chapters and study concepts and get ready for your exam. All right, everybody, have a good evening, and we'll talk again very soon. Bye.